Good afternoon. This is the video talking about the PowerPoint I sent you. I printed it out, and I'm going to talk about each frame. So if you would open that PowerPoint up and just have it on your screen while you're listening to me or looking at me. Pink Floyd. Old shirt too. Got it when they were Pale Floyd. I would like to talk about first and second language acquisition. From this PowerPoint is really an older PowerPoint, but it has all the basic information. There's nothing more exciting than redoing an old PowerPoint to make it look just as boring as it was. So I don't like to do that. But I want to talk to you about a couple of theoretical background issues that deal with language acquisition. And this, you need to take from this what you need to explain to your fellow teachers, your principal, even your community if you need to. It's important to explain to people why ELs have to be taught in a certain way, and why, for example, why is it that they seem to pick up listening and speaking, and then they're in class, but they don't do very well in their homework? That's a huge issue because people say, oh, they know better, they're just not trying. Because people assume if you can read, if you can speak English and you're pretty good, then somehow you must be able to do the homework. And that is a complete fallacy. And there's a little part in here, a little chart showing that. And so this is what I'm going to emphasize in this video. So the first and second language acquisition. Now the second frame shows an arrow. It says behaviorist, and then it goes to nativist and functionalist. These are big terms. Behaviorist is B.F. Skinner. In your psychology, you've learned about response to external stimulus. B.F. Skinner's the guy that trained the mice or the rats to run through the maze, and he would explain how, oh, they learned that 5 left turns, 2 right turns, and 1 left turn, and they get the cheese. And then he would change the maze, and he said, and then they learned the maze. And people suppose from that that's how we learn language. It's just a matter of I say certain things or I hear certain things, I get reinforcement, like you give me a cracker when I say please, and then somehow that's how language is built up. Now, I'm not saying that doesn't have some impact on behavior, but it's not the way language functions. Language is far more complex. If that was true, kind of a joke, but that was true, you could just feed a dog crackers and eventually he'd be able to have conversation with it. I like that joke. Okay, so the evolution of these theories of acquisition up until the 50s, that was very popular because you could prove it scientifically. But the problem is, and this is the key, people can produce a sentence that no one in history has ever spoken before. Like, I remember George Carlin years ago, he said, no one's ever heard the sentence, please saw my legs off. Okay, maybe in the Civil War that somebody said that, but the idea is that I, as a speaker of a language, I can concoct, I can create a sentence that is so grammatically correct, but so bizarre that people say, what does that mean? Why would you say that? It makes sense, but it doesn't, you know. And so that's the idea. That's why we knew the nativists talked about that language, and this is actually, I'm going to talk about these, that nativists and functionalists said that learning a language is something's going on in the brain. It's not just external data from B.F. Skinner's experiments. The old idea, and this goes back to Rousseau, is that people used to think that we were blank slates, that the brain of a baby is just a blank slate, and you can just fill it with whatever you want. You can make them good, you can make them smart. We know that that's not true. No one has the blank slate idea. That's a kind of a romantic nonsense from the 1600s and 1700s. But the idea that we learn language through reinforcement, to some extent, we do learn some things. A child hears words in Chinese and is able to listen and hear Chinese and is able to say the words in Chinese. Okay, the same with English, the same with Arabic, etc. So there is some reinforcement, but we're not just rats in a maze. We're far more complex than that. So if speech were just a habit, then I would just say the things that I've done before. You know, most of our habits are pretty predictable. You know, we go to eat at a certain time, we exercise at a certain time, we have a certain way of holding our face when we're talking to somebody, or we sit in a chair. There's all kinds of habits, but they're pretty limited. They're not just endless, okay? But language is not just a habit. It's a creative endeavor. So, the idea that you can just control language through reinforcement doesn't work. Three Stooges again. Okay, now in the first language acquisition theories, nativist theory, nativist theory and functionalist are pretty close to being the same thing. What is going on there is that we have in our brain a thing called a universal grammar. Whatever language we learn, we'll learn the grammar. Okay, this is taking a normal functioning brain, pretty much. By the way, there are genetically a few people in the world that cannot acquire language. And I know they've done studies on it. It's very weird, but it actually does exist. We know that children acquire language at incredible speed, much faster than how we're inputting it. So Skinner's wrong. Kids can somehow, they take in vast amounts of listening and they pull this in, and then suddenly, you know, you sometimes have youngsters that just blurt out full sentences right from the first word. And some kids take their time, and some kids, but you cannot match the input with the output, because the input is simply examples of how the language functions, and the brain organizes this, picks up all the peripheral things, vocabulary, situations, and produces language. That's why kids can say the damnedest things. If you remember that show on TV it used to be on, or darndest things, sorry, I hate to cuss. But so don't worry too much about this thing, it says template. The point is that we have a thing called a language acquisition device, LAD. Don't have to remember this, but it's in our head, it's unique in the way we're wired, and it's something that 50 to 100,000 years ago, human beings started making language. And before that, we had very limited communication. Okay, I'm endorsing the evolutionary concept here. Okay, now, functionalists agree with most of this. They just simply have added into it that language has a function. You know, we have a subject at the beginning of a sentence. We have verbs. We have tenses that we have some way to mark it, say, oh, I went yesterday, or I am going tomorrow. And you know, one's for the future and one's for the past. And we have a way, we have slots in there. But if we try to explain the slots to people, it gets all murky and weird, because that's why people don't write using grammar. They violate the rules of grammar. And the only way, by the way, the only way to learn the rules of grammar, especially for writing, is to read. Read. Studying grammar rules, who in the world remembers those? I remember once seeing the rules for when to use the, a, and an, the definite, indefinite articles in English. It was for international students. There were 29 rules and examples. Who's going to remember all those? And they only work if you know the context in each case. So it was easier just to take in the language and get used to all the patterns so that you would know it. So we have a thing called the language acquisition device, we take in this information, we create a universal grammar. I don't care if you're learning Chinese, Polish, or Japanese, or German, you're going to produce a grammar. And how do we do this? First of all, we do it with our caregivers, our mothers, our babysitters, our playmates when we're little. We get all this input and we start putting it into order. And then social interaction. We are social creatures. As you can see how I talk on here, I don't get much social interaction. I talk to you. You know, that's why I want to have a Zoom session. I've got one kind of scheduled, and I'm going to bring that up tomorrow, I think. But I need to talk to you because I need to talk to people. It's our nature. Teaching online is a little weird, you know. So to interact with people is essential to get this grammar and to master language. So what does this mean for your classroom? Interaction, interaction, interaction. I'm looking down on, you know, the theories down below. It talks about a summary of them on frame number 6. I was going to number these, but I forgot to tell you the numbers. So essentially, most of our language comes from intense interaction, listening, and observation. Listening is never a passive skill. The only problem is with trying to measure listening is you usually have to make people say something so you know whether they listened and got it correctly. It makes all the difference in the world. Okay, and the key to listening is interaction, and another issue, comprehensible input. It's like somebody said once, if you remember Charlie Brown's teacher, when you'd hear her talk and he wasn't getting it, she'd go blah, 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 blah. Or when people, even when they're talking and all they do is use cliches. It is what it is. Well, that's a classic. I never saw that in Latin. It is what it is. What goes around comes around. You know, all these phrases we have, they're kind of empty, really empty phrases. We have them in academia too. I remember reading a paper the other day. It had all the empty ones, you know. And something speaks volumes. If I ever hear that again, I'm going to scream. Breaks my eardrum. Okay. So you have a summary there of the behaviorists, nativists, and functionalists. What do we bring from this? What do we conclude from this? What we conclude is that you in the classroom must promote interaction. You must promote social interaction, because that's how we get the basis for listening and speaking. And on top of that, you want to have, at some point at a higher level, academic interaction, discussing how to solve a problem. You know, language, spoken language is more formal when you use it in meetings and serious discussions. It's not as much slang, but you can have a little slang. So interaction, comprehensible input. These things are everything. Now, what are some of the ways that language have been taught? All right, on frame number 7 and 8 and 9, that's what I'm looking at now. Second language methods. Now I'm going to show you examples of these in the future, but just to give you an idea, from time immemorial, the Greeks, the ancient Egyptians, the Sumerians, teaching people language, and I don't mean speaking and listening, I'm talking academic language, grammar and translation. The scribes in ancient Egypt would have their wax tablets. In ancient Sumeria, they'd have clay tablets that were wet, and they would practice putting their letters on them, wedges. And then the Egyptians, they had a stylus, and they would make the Egyptian marks for different things. And it was an alphabet. It was pronounced. But grammar translation was how, and you were taught this way in your Spanish class. I think we had a previous discussion about that. I don't know if it's this class or another class, but I asked you, how was your high school Spanish or French? And a lot of you were told, this is a word, phrase in Spanish, what is it in English? And that was such an empty, because you don't have the speaking or listening skills, but you're translating it like it's a code or something on a computer. Grammar translation has very little value except for the very learned, scholarly type people that are studying the structure of the language. And that can be very interesting, but the vast majority of people don't function that way. Most people learn English, and then when they find out their writing isn't very good, and then you get scolded. You must capitalize. You don't capitalize in verbal because nobody knows what that means. You must put a exclamation mark, although I could say, yeah, and that's an exclamation mark, speaking it. Okay, so grammar translation was very dominant, very dull, very boring, and it continues, and you will see it taught in a lot of places. It's all focused on the teacher. There's not a lot of interaction. And if your child's taking a language course and all you're doing is translating back and forth and you don't speak very much, you can go through 4 years of Spanish or French or German and you get out of school and you can't even order a hot dog at Oktoberfest or a hamburger in Hamburg. Okay, now, the next method that came out was the direct or Berlitz. It kind of came out accidentally. But what happened was that supposedly the story is, and this explains it, whether it's true or not, they hired a guy to teach French to some people in Europe. There's either French there or French in the United States. And the guy arrived, and he's a French teacher. He didn't speak any English. He didn't speak the language of the students. And people said, well, how are you going to explain it? Well, what did he do? He had to point and say words and make phrases and do it all in context. And by golly, it worked great. The kids learned French from the first day, and they actually did very, very well. And it's called the Berlitz method. Or the direct. Direct means I just give you the language you got to learn. I speak Chinese and we don't have anything else. And you're saying, how could I learn Chinese? And then I do Chinese for mouse, and I do the motions, and I say dance, or I shake your hands, or take off your glasses in Chinese or something. And then you gradually begin to get it in context. And then you slowly, like a child, you build up competence in the language. What's nice about it is it gives you real power. You really are using the language. There's none of this translating stuff. You're directly in the Chinese or in the Spanish. It's very mysterious, and it can be very frustrating. If you did this to an 8th grade Spanish class, you probably lose control of them. You got to have a lot of types of people focused. Some personalities can't stand it. They demand to know what everything is immediately in their own language. So the Berlitz method has much value, and it's called the direct method. Now, in the 1950s, after World War II, a new method was created. They had to mass produce people that could speak languages so they could go on CIA missions or military missions, or even in business, they do this. I need you to go to Germany and work with some people and train them on our equipment. And you say, well, I don't speak German and they don't speak English. And he said, well, we're going to teach you German. We're going to teach you 100 phrases specially constructed about the work you're going to be doing, other than saying hello and goodbye and a few basic things. We're going to teach you how, please open the computer case, and they would have that in German and you would practice it. How did they teach this? Well, they sometimes did it by repeating it and you repeated it back. So you sounded more German and they could check your pronunciation. But you still were sitting there thinking, what am I doing? What am I doing? And then they put it on tape, or they put it on a sheet of paper, and they had you read it, and they had you practice the sound so you would sound more German. And then they would have you study patterns. This is a little bit like B.F. Skinner. I'm going to teach you the habits of saying 50 things or 100 things in German till you can produce them automatically without even thinking. And then you speak German, but you speak only the German within the context of what you were taught. You don't think outside of it very much. You may not even know much about the verbs, You can teach somebody many phrases in a language and they're kind of cool to use. But if you have to adjust the phrase to put a different noun in or a different person, you don't know how to do it because you're really not flexible with the language. It's like a template. This is what it is. It has to work the way it is. I can't really adjust it. That can work. You can mass produce people that know some Vietnamese or know German or whatever, but they don't know a lot of German. And this was actually used to teach in high schools or to teach in college. People would put big old earphones on and you'd listen to a tape, and the tape would say, and there's somebody up there listening to you, but they're just checking to make sure you're not snoring. And then it would say, ¿Dónde está mi lápiz? Which means, where's my pencil? And you would say, and the answer would be, mi lápiz está en mi cuaderno. My pencil is in my notebook or in my escritorio, my desk. And so you would go through these very weird, meaningless, basically meaningless conversations. And you would learn it, and you would learn it. But the problem is you were emotionally so bored that you were like this inside. You were like, but you would just mouth the words. So you got credit for your lab session. This is not the way to teach a language either. In fact, they don't even have that. But if you ever remember, if anybody's ever seen these, they used to have these big old tape machines and everybody had a tape and earphones and there was a lot of wires all over the place. And people thought this was the future of language. I can teach you Spanish in one semester. Forgot one thing. The person is not engaged. They're bored. They're not even listening. It would be like, I'm going to teach you how to be a cook by having you sit in front of a television while somebody does their thing on a cooking class on TV. You know, unless it's Julia Childs, who was hilarious, you wouldn't remember anything, you know. So that's the other issue, engagement. So we got comprehensible input, we got context, we got interaction, and then we got to have focus. You got to make me care about this. That's why a lot of people learn language when they fall in love with somebody from another country. Then their French gets a lot better because they focus on every word their beloved tells them, and they want to know what those words mean. Okay. But that's a heavy price to pay to learn a language. I have to fall in love with all these people. Okay, the last one on this frame number 7, is called communicative. And that's really everything after 1970, I would say, all the way up. And communicative means interaction. It means comprehensible input. It means we're communicating, which means we're done. You know, I go to the pie shop or I go to the bread shop in France, and I actually have people talking to me, and I'm ordering the bread and I'm asking about the bread. And what I don't know, they explain to me if they're patient. That's one thing you got to be, is very patient. You can't just say, look in the book. It doesn't work that way. That's how they teach chemistry. That's why nobody learns chemistry. So that's that frame. Now, what do we know? This is just a summary. We know that we learn language by developing a grammar in our head, language acquisition device. We process and we know English grammar. Doesn't mean we know the proper written grammar, but we know when somebody speaks and we say, that's weird. Are you from another country? Is English your first language? Errors are normal. Can you imagine not getting yelled at every time you make a mistake, but to say, hey, well, I don't believe in overpraising errors because people make errors for fun, but you essentially say, I made a mistake. And you said, yes, but that's a logical mistake. Many mistakes are not accidents. They're attempts to guess what is the correct way to say something. Same thing in math. You make mistakes because you don't know all the steps. You miss something. That's an opportunity to learn. People learn, not just children, people learn language in positive communicative settings where they are respected. If you have a Spanish teacher who's sarcastic and is mean to people, hell, that's true in any kind of class. Like, you guys probably will never figure this out. Well, that's a real positive. You have to be just as encouraging as if when you were little and you learned to ride your tricycle or the bicycle. You didn't have a parent saying, "Come on, quit falling off the bike. You're never going to get it." Those kind of statements, you would be shocked to hear a parent say that. You don't want a Spanish teacher being sarcastic with you. You don't want a math teacher being sarcastic. Sarcasm doesn't work well unless you've got people that know everything about how they are. Now, here's something that is a little different from what Krashen said. Krashen said we learn a second language like we learn the first language. In theory, that's true, but in context, it's not. Here's why. Most of us don't learn our second language till we're in high school, and then we don't have a very good experience. We don't get very much exposure to it. It's 1 hour a day in a Spanish class. But if you learn a second language by going and living in Brussels, Belgium or someplace, or is that Netherlands? The Hague's in Netherlands. Anyhow, I have a student over there. Oh yeah, of course. Sorry. Anyhow, if you have a student go to a foreign country, they'll learn the language because they'll just get blitzed. First week or two, you'll be exhausted because you don't understand anything. And then you gradually just start taking pieces at a time, and then you start seeing it. It's going too fast, and it's like slowing a movie down so you can see all the action. Film that's really fast. You see something go by, and then somebody takes it with, 500 frames a second. You can see the butterfly. Oh, that's what it's doing, Your mind's like that. You get blitzed. You can't do it. So first language learned at home by young children, by their loved ones are teaching it. They love them. They don't have to pass a test because there's no test. You don't give a baby a test to go baba or dada. You just love them for it. Everything's wonderful. There's no pressure. Well, I don't think I've seen that, but you imagine somebody putting pressure on the kid to start speaking. Come on, say the words. Second languages have just the reverse. You learn it at school or at work. You learn it under duress. You're an older person, and therefore your ego is sensitive to being criticized when you make a mistake. Little children are not upset when they make a mistake. They don't know to be upset. But older adults, especially older adults, it's not they can't learn the language. It's that they're embarrassed about making mistakes. And they kind of back off and refuse and say, "Oh, I'm too old to learn." Your brain is not old. Your attitude is bad. Remember these. Quite possible for me to learn to be quite fluent in Swedish. Now, speaking Swedish, I know ski is from the Scandinavian language. But if I were to devote myself 1 year to learning Swedish, I would speak fairly well. Okay? It's a conscious process. You learn the second language, you're thinking all the time. And when you're a little kid, you were just letting it slide into your mind. But when you're older, you try to ask all kinds of reasons. Why? What is this? How does it relate to that? That takes up a lot of time because you don't just pull in the language. You pull it in and then you're looking at it like it's you don't know whether you trust it or not. And you're under a lot of pressure. Imagine this, you're in a Spanish class, after the first 2 weeks, you have a written test. Wouldn't it be nice just to have a spoken, a listening test or a speaking test? What are 10 ways to say, "Hello, I love you" in Spanish or something, or phrases? And you could rattle those off, but if you have to spell them, then you have to learn to read and write and spell and memorize and everything else. That's kind of an issue. What does that mean for the ESL student? Well, it means that you got to keep all this in mind because you want to make it as pleasant as possible for the ESL student. They come in, they're very young, they're nervous, they're in a class. They have to have a thing called a silent period or a time when they listen before they produce language. But our system says, I talk to you tomorrow or next day, you have to talk back to me, or you have to take a written test in a week. That's another mistake. The silent period is critical in learning a language. If I want to learn Swedish, as I mentioned, I would like to just listen to people within a context, observe people speaking Swedish until my mind gets used to and I start hearing the sounds, because you can't produce a sound if you cannot hear it. You know, there's sounds in Arabic, German, in Spanish, the onion, the N with the N-Y on it. It's called the onion sound, and a little tilde on there. And people don't know how to pronounce that, or the double R, ferrocarril, and they can't go, arr. I can't say that, I can't roll my tongue, and some people can't. So they say ferrocarril. So it's not quite accurate, but it's the best they can do. Okay, so what do we expect in the classroom? All comprehension, all instruction is comprehensible. You don't throw things at people that nobody can understand. You usually show them things, like Mrs. Amin, you show them things. Taza, cafe, medicina, telefono. I don't know how you say cell, I guess cellular? I don't know. So learning should be interactive. So if I were teaching you Spanish online, it would be a little tough. We'd have to do it on Zoom. You know, years ago, they used to have online Spanish lessons, and people at high schools would watch the lesson, and they would just sit there, and the teacher never saw them. Teacher would say, ¿Dónde está mi lápiz? And the kids would just say, if they said anything without laughing, they would just sit there and look at it. So it's like learning how to communicate with fish by watching them in the aquarium. You know, there's nothing going on there. Learning should be interactive. This is frame number 10. Instruction should be challenging. Here's the part that's often missed. Don't ask people, what color is your pencil? What a dumb question. Ask them, ¿escribe usted con lápiz o rojo? Or, I'm sorry, con lápiz or pluma? And then they learn, you know, one's pen and one's pencil. I use something other than pluma now, I forget, but that's what I learned a long time ago. Instruction should connect the school to the students. That's why you do that cultural map, because then you say, oh, ¿Dónde vive Juan? ¿Dónde vive Juan? Where does Juan live? And you say, él vive cerca de la Iglesia Católica. He lives close to the Catholic Church, because you have his little culture map and you can talk about that. Instruction should emphasize literacy and language across the curriculum. So it's really good if you're dealing with ESLs, they're using as much English as they can in history, geography, chemistry, etc. Now, obviously, when you move outside an ESL class, you have to work very closely with the classroom teacher, which means somewhat the lessons have to be boiled down so the concepts can be understood. If you're teaching about plateaus and rivers and mountains and valleys and things, you may have a little vocabulary list that has the English and the Spanish, if they're Spanish speakers, and then have visuals. You have pictures of those things. So you're focusing all the time. Do they understand it? Is it comprehensible stuff? Are they getting to do something back and forth? Is it interesting exercise, or are they just memorizing vocabulary and that's about it? They never use the vocabulary. So it's not easy teaching English as second language. It's an active state of mind. And then there's a little summary here on 11. It's comprehensibility, interaction, and thinking skills. A lot of times nowadays with students, we don't have thinking skills. We just want you to reproduce something. Wrong. Now, why would we integrate? And here's going to be with the PSYOP. Why are we integrating language ESL instruction with the content of the classes like math class, chemistry, reading class? You're reading Edgar Allan Poe, you know. Not my first choice for ESL. He's weird for anybody. But the key is you want the student to have access to what the content is in the mainstream classes. You do this for two reasons. One, they need to learn it in order to be educated. And two, they need to learn it in order to not only master the language and be challenged, but they need to earn credits. They need to pass a history class. They need to pass a science class. A lot of schools will sometimes have these courses and they'll say math, ESL students in there. Some people put like a math class where people struggle or business math. They'll combine remedial math with ESL. I don't necessarily like that because you're not remedial because you're ESL. But the point is you may put a mixed group in there. It's good to have a mixed group. You want native speakers of English in there with other people. If you go someplace and they put all the Americans in a little room in Peru to teach you Spanish, you're going to speak English. You need to have Peruvians there, Spanish speakers. All right. You want to promote the intellectual development of the student. So basically, you want to challenge people while you're also teaching them a language they do not speak or speak well, and read and not read well. That's why ESL teachers are really smart. They have to be culturally fluent. They have to understand other groups. They have to be compassionate. They have to be, hopefully they know other languages, but they don't have to. But they have to be skilled in instructional preparation. In other words, how can I make this, if I have a class on animal and plant cells, how can I have an ESL student participate this even with limited English and still understand the content? Okay, and you probably, if you're thinking, you say, well, we need to have visuals. Right. Pictures are very good. Visuals are big. Videos, if they're relevant online. Activities where the students build something or make something, or they do a demonstration and explain what the parts of the cell are. Or if they're doing the Old West, they explain what it's like to be a Native American living in Nebraska in the 1840s. How did they cook their food? You can do this because a person learns it in English. I mean, it's presented in English, but they can learn the English and how it's presented and participate with other students. And people correct each other. People help each other. That's why we have interaction. I keep coming back to that. Now, two types of language. Basic concepts that you're going to have to get across to parents, other peer teachers who do not understand ESL students, English learners, and your staff and your principal maybe. They say, why not? They speak English, but their academics are terrible. They're just lazy. Anytime you start hearing people attribute moral shortfall or a lack of discipline or something, you know, you're just lazy, or you're just inattentive, or you're being obstinate, et cetera, that is so pathetic. That's so easy to fall back on. And you must make people sensitive. That's because it's easy to criticize people. You don't know how to cook. You don't try very hard. The spaghetti's awful. You boiled it. You obviously didn't. I started attributing everything that you must have done for it to be bad. Either you didn't do it or you did it wrong or whatever. Negative. Stop that. All right, social academic skills. This is also known as Basic Interpersonal Communication Skills, BICS, B-I-C-S, versus Academic Language or Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency Skills. BICS, the social, is what I'm doing now. It's talking. I'm not too academic right now, but if we were just having a conversation about whatever, that is BICS. It's playground English, it's street English, it's not cussing, although that would fall into it. It's how we talk to each other informally. It doesn't have to be precise. We're just trying to get the gist of things. We're just getting along. Sometimes we're going, yeah, okay, whatever. You know, things like that. Academic, which is in frame number 14, is the technical vocabulary you need to know to what? Do chemistry experiments, to talk about grammar, to talk about American history. You know, if you talk about the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1850, known as the Missouri Compromise. And people say, oh, yeah, well, what is that? They compromised Missouri? I said, no, it's a compromise involving Missouri, but it was about another state. Now, what does this mean? It means that we have to be very precise in what we're arguing about. If I say the factory of the cell is the mitochondria, you're going to have to learn the word mitochondria. It's the organelle, the little organ that's in a cell, an animal cell, that produces energy. You can't call it a factory. It has to be mitochondria, okay? Because that's too general a term. If we're talking about grammar and I say the subject of the sentence or the predicate of the sentence, the predicate means what? It means the verb and things thereafter, okay? Technical vocabulary is harder and takes more time. You have to not only kind of memorize it, but then you have to have them use it so they're able to use it. If I say the topic sentence in a paragraph or the thesis of your essay, you have to know what is a thesis and where does it go? What is a topic sentence and where would it be located? And how do I know it is the topic sentence and what does it do? Technical information. So it's higher order thinking. For instance, if I explain to someone, I say, please explain to me why did fog form over Nebraska yesterday when the temperature was 40 degrees outside? And of course, you can't just answer that informally. You have to sit there and think, warm air, cool air, humidity, precipitation, wind. You have to think about all the things that could have caused it and then try to come to a conclusion. And a lot of times you have to do this by observation or interacting with other people. You can't just do it in your head. Same thing with math problems. If you have a tough math problem, you have to go through the steps. You can't skip them. You can't just come up with what is, solve for x when, 3x minus 5 in parentheses times 7x plus 2x minus 8x or minus 8 and then have equals 0. And I say that, and you can't just do it in your head. You have to go through and do the steps. And you have to talk about, divide by, multiply by, all those terms that are technical terms. All right. So academic language is really the meat and potatoes for the teacher, although obviously the ESL teacher has to deal with both social and academic. Now, the last thing I want you to take away from this is that little chart here on the number 15, and it says that social and academic. It says here that, well, you can learn speaking a language in 2 years, and that can vary from 6 months to 5 years, depending on how good you are or terrible you are, opportunities you get. And then academic language takes 5 to 10 years. What is academic language? Well, it's writing in paragraphs, it's reading essays, it's writing essays, it's reading a novel, it's reading a technical manual, it's reading pages in a book on psychology and explaining the difference between bipolar and schizophrenia. That's a perfect academic exercise. What is the difference between bipolar and schizophrenia? And you can't just answer it. You have to go through and look at all the terms and understand them all. Academic English, CALPS. Social English is just simply saying, hey, why don't you come over to my house and we'll play Monopoly? Or, hey, let's go out and have a party. Or let's have a big dinner for the family this weekend. We'll have fried chicken and it won't be KFC, etc. That's social communication, informal. Okay, I hope this has helped. On your discussion, I want you to kind of break this down, and everything I've told you is essential knowledge. But the key here, and you can keep this PowerPoint, is you can modify this and just explain it to other teachers. That when you understand spoken and listening, and I mean, when you kid appears very fluent in English, doesn't mean he can read in English. If that's true, you wouldn't teach reading. Everybody who learns to speak English, they should automatically be able to read. Another thing on the last frame, 16, talks about supporting the first language. This is a big deal with me. When someone comes in and they speak Arabic, or they speak Somali, or they speak Hindi, always encourage them to continue reading in their own language, even if you don't know anything about it. Now, if you could happen to get a couple of bilingual books, which in Spanish English is very common, but in Hindi English would be quite a step, but I'm sure there are such books. Even a few books like that, even if you just got a couple, are very useful in helping respect the background of the child and keep them connected. Because if they lose their first language and go all English, and people think this, oh, you need to get rid of your first language to become the second language. That is a disaster. Do you know why? The answer is they lose their connections to their first culture. They may no longer respect or listen to or talk to their parents. And this happened in many, I know in Nebraska, in many places, where the parents come into a new country and they immediately try to dispense with their own language. They say, we're not going to speak Vietnamese at home, English only. And of course, they're not very good at English, so they don't speak very much. And the kid learns English and then ends up being the expert, and sometimes has to go translate because the parents still speak their first language. And that's an issue, the whole idea of translating. You shouldn't have a 9-year-old kid going and explaining bank information. Your school and your businesses and your community should have professional, competent, they don't have to be certified, but people that can talk about the same topic in 2 different languages. If you have a bank officer, you should have somebody who speaks Spanish who can handle bank deposits and business in Spanish. Okay, that's all I got to say. I don't want to make this too long, but it's probably too long. Look forward to talking to you. We'll start on the book in about a week, and I'm going to send a thing out on those Zoom meetings, okay?